Thanks, Paul. Yeah, that's true. I'd just come back from performing at Busselton Songfest when I had to send Paul the abstract and title. So I was definitely in a choir-like mood. But it seemed suitable given that I was going to be talking to a room full of geologists about the importance of geology. And so I feel like it's an easy sell to this crowd, as opposed to if I'm talking to a room full of ecologists trying to convince them of the value of geology. So yeah, thanks for inviting me. It's really lovely to be here and talk to some new and some also friendly faces that I've known for a while. Tonight I'm going to present a few different case studies from the research that I've been doing across Western Australia, trying to unpack the geological controls on streamflow generation and surface water persistence. So as global population increases and climates are shifting and we're using more and more water as people, it's becoming increasingly important that we document not just where things are wet and where the water is, but why the water is where it is, so that we can properly manage and protect water resources. I'd like to start by making an acknowledgement of country, that we are meeting here today on Whadjuk Noongar country, and all of the sites that I have worked on have cultural significance for the traditional owners of the land on which they sit. This is a little summary of my choir, my scientific choir. It's a subset of relevant to the work I'm going to be presenting today. I certainly couldn't do all this work on my own. I've got a range of Master of Hydrogeology students that are always really great to work with. I've got a couple of PhD students at the moment also who are fantastic, and collaborators at the various departments. Rio Tinto Iron Ore have been helping me out a lot in the Pilbara, colleagues at Flinders University and also at UWA. So my thanks to all of those people who have also contributed to this talk, even though they're not here tonight. So here's really kind of the overarching question that you might start out with if you weren't all geologists, because you're going to say, yes, it is important. There's a lot of work happening at the moment specifically looking at intermittent streams, or IRES as they can be called, intermittent rivers and ephemeral streams. I prefer to just use the term non-perennial as a more inclusive term that then means I don't have to spell out all these letters. So as a hydrological community, there's a lot of work happening to try and map and identify non-perennial streams. This is a paper that was in Nature last year, where they did a statistical analysis, really built a kind of statistical model using 2D data sets that were available at global scale, and predicted the lengths of stream that were, how many days of the year they would flow, basically, and found that something like 40% of the global stream network was non-perennial if you defined it as at least one day of no flow every year. And the proportion of our streams that is non-perennial is increasing, we know. So there's a lot of work being done to map non-perenniality, but one of the things that I see is missing in a lot of work is that we're not accounting for the 3D nature of groundwater systems. So if you're doing an analysis like this, you can use 2D maps of bedrock geology, surface geology perhaps, soil mapping, but you can't account for the structures that are really the things that are controlling where groundwater is coming to the surface. There are a few studies though that have demonstrated the importance of geological controls on streamflow generation, and not just in non-perennial streams. One of the papers I like is this one by Katie Costigan, who looked at topographic and geological controls and a couple of other things to try and unpack what's happening. That was specifically in non-perennial streams, that one. But still, you can't really account very much for structures necessarily. So she's got from small grains to sort of, grain size distribution and that sort of thing that can link to permeability. And across on the far right-hand side, at watershed scale, which is the same thing as a catchment if you're a North American, changes in lithologic transitions, which is great. But that's again something you see in 2D, right? Like it goes from here to here, but actually it's a shape. It's got structure, it's got things happening. So even though I think we've been pretty good at documenting the shapes of things for surface water persistence for about 100 years. And I love Brian 1919, I don't think there's anything better for describing springs, why they occur and where they occur. But we don't really have very many observational studies of streams, lakes that receive groundwater outflow, why the water is where it is, and therefore we're not going to be very good at predicting how those systems are going to change under drying climates, wetting climates potentially, or increased use of groundwater resources. Luckily for us, Western Australia is a really great place to try and do this sort of work. We have a range of rivers, lakes, springs and persistent pools that I've been lucky enough to work on across an awesome climate gradient. So we've got tropical systems in the north, right down to temperate systems at the bottom, and geological differences that I don't really need to explain to this room, but sedimentary basins, hard rock provinces. And so this gives a real diversity to the types of features that we can describe and put in the literature so that other people can see the ways in which the geological structures that host groundwater systems are important for surface water systems and the bits you see at the top. So really I'm trying to encourage people to think beyond, and by people I don't mean you, I mean the ecologists and the surface hydrologists, to think beyond just the bits they see at the top and to realise that the bits deeper down and 100 kilometres over there can be still really important for what you're seeing here. And it's important for the ecosystems as well, not just for us, but here's a picture of a northern quoll. I like to try and include a bit of charismatic fauna in every talk. That needs these wet riparian zones that are along streams that receive groundwater outflow in order for it to be happy. So it's important for people that we are able to understand why places are wet, and it's also important for the receiving environments. I'm just going to talk to you about 3 of the sites that I've been working on in tonight's talk. I do want to point out though, my PhD student Thiago has been working up on the Fitzroy River, and I just want to make a note, if you know anybody who's doing a PhD, please be extra kind to them, because COVID and the shutdown has been really difficult for PhD students. So please be extra kind. I'm sure you're all kind to PhD students anyway, but it's been particularly difficult this last few years. So please be very nice to anybody you know who's doing a PhD. He had a difficult time getting access to his field site and various other lab delays, horrendous at the moment, terrible. And also, I will mention to you that I'm looking for a PhD student to do some work on Wilson Nature Reserve. So if you know anybody that might be interested in a PhD, looking at spring discharge and residence times of groundwater and the water coming out of the springs and how that links to the ironstone deposits, and there's threatened ecological communities, and it's all very awesome. So if you know anybody, please do put them in touch with me. That'd be grand. But these are the 3 I'm going to talk to you. I decided I would go just top down, so I'm going to start with the Dampier Peninsula and then talk about Hammersley Basin, and then finish with some slides about Rosie's PhD on the Donnelly River. So up on the Dampier Peninsula, this was work instigated by the Department of Water and Environmental Regulation. And you can see from aerial photography that there's this area of, I better have a pointer, area of defined surface drainage just here. So when you zoom in on the peninsula, it's clearly different from everything else. And the traditional owners could tell us that there were areas of flow year-round, even throughout the dry season, in this system. And so the department wanted to better understand the mechanisms of streamflow generation in that area and how the groundwater resources were relating to the surface water drainage. So they instigated quite a substantial investigation program that extended beyond this area, but I'm just going to focus on the results from here. It included drilling and monitoring bore installation, surface water loggers were installed, and the key limitation on there was access, which if you've been to this part of the world you can understand. So there's 2 tracks in the south, one that goes out to Spring Creek and one to Wanganut Spring, and then there's an Aboriginal community, Jabba Jabba, that has a little track that goes to that as well. But that was the only road access we had. I seem to have lost my scale, unfortunately, but these are 15, is that 15 kilometres? Over there, oh yes, 10, yeah, I think these squares are strangely 15 kilometres for some reason. I don't know why I did that. Anyway, that's a 10 kilometre scale, exactly. They also did an extensive AEM geophysical survey, which turned out to be really useful. Had a master's student, Jasmine Rothery, that did a longitudinal stream hydrochemistry survey, and I will have to remember to unpack that for you because it may be something that you guys aren't overly familiar with. And Chago, my PhD student, did some image analysis as well. So there was a lot of work that went into this. One of the first observations is that there's a difference in surface lithology when you go there to this area. So most of the Dampier Peninsula has this deep permeable Pindan sands, whereas within the drainage area, there was cemented sandy clays and silts. That immediately suggests that you're going to have a runoff generation mechanism that you wouldn't have if you have these deep, highly permeable sands. So that's the first streamflow generation mechanism we could identify, runoff, and completely controlled by the change in geology. Chago then did this spatial analysis based on aerial imagery and mapping water persistence, which you can imagine is challenged by canopy cover and the width of the stream being able to be detected by the pixel. But he's now devoted 2.5 years of his life to this, and he's gotten quite good at it. So there are 7 watershed or 7 catchments in the study area, and most of where we saw the perennial stream flow, this was the channel that the traditional owners were able to identify as having perennial flow, and this was where Jasmine targeted for her stream flow, stream chemistry survey. But in addition to the kind of point springs that we knew about, we saw that there were this series of reaches at the top here, or the right-hand side, I guess, that had persistent flow. And when we looked, well, the thing to notice here, as you have it overlaid with the elevation, is that it's not actually at a break of slope. It's not a topographic control on that. When we looked at the AEM data, and I've just shown you 2 lines. They did them, they did every 2 kilometres or something like that. But these 2 show the key feature that I want you to see, which is this yellow layer in here, which I'm nominally calling the Geologically clay. Now, Field Commander in the back of the room, we've had a number of conversations about this, and I decided to just handball it back to the department. So it's not a named thing. I'm not saying it's anything at all, except that it's a clay, and we've colloquially talked about it as the Geologically clay. So don't go looking for a new anything in the database. It does not exist. It's just in my paper. But here it is. And what we saw that was really interesting was that here it's much deeper, and then in the south it becomes shallower. So it's kind of dipping and thinning. And if we look at where this persistent, where this line of springs comes out, it kind of fits with where that clay is kind of shallowing up. And so we have a conceptualization then where the groundwater is regionally coming in this direction, and then as this clay becomes shallow, it's forcing the groundwater towards the surface, and we get this set of springs. So rather than being topographically controlled, it's controlled by the thinning of the unconfined aquifer. So that's the second mechanism of streamflow generation. We've got runoff, and we've got persistent perennial groundwater springs. And both of those things are a function of geology. Now here's some groundwater levels. This plot here is from a bore near the stream at Jabba Jabba, and then a bore at the water table but not near the stream at Jabba Jabba. And so what you can see here down here is rainfall, and you've got the seasonal, here's the wet season, here's the dry season. And this dashed line up here is the level of the stream bed. So away from the stream, we see this peak and then subsequent recession in the water table height during the wet season. What we see at the stream is that that peak is truncated, and we're interpreting that as groundwater outflow to the stream. That's our third mechanism of streamflow generation. And really that's happening where the unconfined aquifer is thinner, so that it's kind of filling up and then spilling out into the stream. This figure on the right here is hydraulic head contours or potentiometric contours. Those who maybe haven't looked at groundwater data lately, it's just like topography, and that groundwater will go from higher values to lower values. So we have this kind of radial recharge mound looking feature, and then groundwater outflow radially towards the coast. And these are the elevations of springs, the elevations of the land surface rather, at springs And then this line through here is where Jasmine did her longitudinal stream survey. Now this is where I need to take a beat and explain in a little more detail things like radon. There's this thing called radon. You're probably all familiar with radon. But the way we use it in surface water groundwater studies is that any water that goes into the subsurface will pick up radon. It's just naturally generated through uranium-thorium decay series. Because radon is a gas, water that comes to the surface rapidly degasses and will equilibrate or lose its radon. And so any water that has radon has been in the subsurface recently. And this makes it a really useful tracer for surface water groundwater interaction studies. And so Jasmine measured radon concentrations along the stream as well as stream flow and stable isotope values. And I think here's a terrible slide of data, please forgive me. What she found was stream flow increases, particularly across this section here, between 10 and 15. These are tributaries here, so those steep jumps are the tributary inflows that are coming in, which are accounted for in the water and mass balance calculations. The dots are measured values, so they walked, I did not, they walked the stream they walked the whole 25 kilometres to take these samples. Chloride, now what's happening here is we've got a spring that comes out and then the flow dries up. And so in your model, if you're modelling chloride and your water is evaporating, your chloride goes very, very high, right? So that's what this spike is, even though we don't see it in the measured data. But we do know that went dry there, and then a tributary comes in and we get some more water. And then we see these increases or changes, I guess, where the tributary inflows are. This is the stable isotopic evolution along the stream, which actually turned out to be really useful for constraining the groundwater inflows in a way that I didn't expect. But because there was quite a bit of variability in the groundwater end member, or uncertainty, I guess, in how we could constrain the radon content in the groundwater, it was really helpful to have this additional tracer that was actually very well constrained. We didn't get much variability in groundwater isotopic values at all. So that was really nice to have that extra bit of data. And from all of this, you're able to calculate or estimate then the groundwater influx coming in. And so we had this main zone of groundwater discharge coming in addition to this initial spring at the top. This whole sampling started at a headwater spring. And here you've got a slightly negative flux to groundwater, which is because the spring water at the top goes out and then infiltrates into the surface. So you've got losing conditions, it's called, in the top 5 kilometres, and then gaining conditions further down where groundwater is coming in. And interestingly, we couldn't match this chloride data with just one chloride concentration. We needed to have a high chloride and then a lower chloride end member, which I'm going to come back to when I talk about this. So this is, hopefully, a video. This is Brad Deegan's from Department of Water and Environment Regulation. And this is a little spring that was kind of bubbling up in the stream. So you can see the groundwater coming out at the surface, and you can tell that it's under pressure. And so there's some mechanism then. This is not at the headwater springs. This is halfway down. There's some other mechanism that's creating pressure and forcing groundwater out and up to the surface. Yeah. And so, perhaps I might do this one, or it's debatable which order I go. At any rate, keep that in your mind, that there's something causing pressure. Here's what we saw in the water level loggers. So here in the dry season, in the stream that we knew was perennial, that Jasmine did her longitudinal sampling along, there is water all year round, and then you see these kind of flashy events in the beginning. And oh, gracious. Who were we talking about, the Irish club? And then they would go, yeah. Okay. And then particularly here in Yellow River, you see it's definitely just like ephemeral, flashy flows and runoff. It's not It's nothing that's persisting seasonally. It rains, it flows a little bit, and then it stops. So that's what's happening in the beginning of the wet season. As the unconfined aquifer fills up, then we start to get that discharge into the stream because of the seasonal rise of the water table. And then we see flows across the wet season that then recede. And then we have here from the spring discharge permanent flow in Spring Creek. So there's 3 things very clearly shown in this data, which are this permanent groundwater outflow from springs, that's perennial, and then these runoff events in response to rainfall early in the dry season, and then this seasonal water table related groundwater outflow. But this still leaves us with the question of how are we getting this kind of groundwater bubbling up under pressure? Because if it's just the water table dribbling out into the stream, you shouldn't really see it bubbling up under pressure necessarily. But what we think is happening there is over here. So because of these layers in the hills that have high permeability, low permeability, we think it's creating these small scale contact springs, basically, where the head can build up in here and then it discharges under pressure as you move along the stream. And conveniently, we don't lean on this heavily in the paper, but the distance along the stream that you see these things at, the intervals, does make sense with the thickness of the layers that you see. So that's what we think is happening. And that is the fourth, ladies and gentlemen, the fourth. A mechanism of stream flow generation. And this whole system really is controlled by the geology. 4 mechanisms, they're all depending on the geology. So we've got our headwater springs, we've got contact springs along the way, we've got the unconfined aquifer fills up, and it fills up because the Jalomite clay is there, making it smaller. And then we have runoff that happens from the low permeability sediments. So it's a whole little sequence of geological controls that create this drainage network up on the Dampier Peninsula. So that's my first little parable, if you will. Now, I want to talk a little bit now about persistent river pools. You can call these all sorts of things. Water holes. I should have rehearsed my list before I came in. We've got a paper in review and there's about 20 different names these things have been called, right? But we're talking about the water that persists in pools along non-perennial rivers. And there's a bunch of literature that kind of relates to persistent river pools, but has never actually been pulled together in that context. And I know this because I had students working on them and I tried to find a paper to describe these things for them and it didn't exist. So we decided to write one. And this next little bit is kind of about the evolution of that paper. So there's this literature on groundwater springs, which I mentioned before. It's been around for a very long time. It's never explicitly been kind of in the literature related to persistent river pools, even though there's this idea that pools can be springs, right? Like it's a thing that people have in their head, but it's never quite written down or articulated in peer-reviewed papers. There's also, and I hadn't really thought about this very much until one of my reviewers waved it in my face, but there's a bunch of literature, no, there's not a bunch, there's a tiny amount of literature on rock pools, which can sometimes occur along rivers. And so this also can relate. There's a lot of literature on surface water groundwater interaction, and my PhD is a classic example of this. In sort of the 90s and the 2000s, when people realised that they were counting water twice, once as surface water and another time as groundwater, which meant that we were very much overestimating the amount of water we thought we had. And so collectively it was decided we should get better at working out how much groundwater was going to surface water and how much surface water was going to groundwater. So a lot of effort got put into that, which was great. But the thing that kind of got smoothed over in that whole body of work is, I think, the geological structures that are important in controlling where these exchanges take place. And then there's another body of literature that kind of sits within that, which is about hypereic exchange, which is the process of, if you have a stream that's flowing along, there's little ripples in the stream bed, and little bits of water will circulate around that. And then also as the stream meanders, water will kind of cut across through the sediments in the subsurface. And the other one is if you've got a pool, a pool and then a riffle, that's what I mean to say, not a ripple, but a riffle, the water will kind of go down and then come back in at the bottom. So there's these multiple scales of exchange happening. They turn out to be really important for biogeochemical cycling in streams, and so a lot of work has been done understanding that, which also has some link to river pools, but was never really articulated. So here's what we had a crack at. Here's the Hammersley Basin. I'm sure you're all familiar with the Hammersley Basin. We're basically digging it up and putting it on a train and sending it to China, which is fun. But this is the mapping of these little white dots with blue centres are water holes from a topographic 250K data set. So you can see there's a lot of them, and they do tend to fall along these lines, which are drainage lines. We've got a lot of different catchments in the Hammersley Basin. They're quite kind of lots of smaller catchments defined by the relief. And then Rio Tinto had done a lot of work understanding the pools, I'm going to call them, that were kind of in the areas where they were working. And so we've used some data from a subset of the pools that they had studied. They had done sort of detailed studies at 20 odd pools. And so we've used a subset of that data to kind of form the backbone of this paper. And so I'm going to say that there are really just three mechanisms. If you look at those springs papers, right, there's like 20 different types of springs, and there's actually like 5 or 6 different classification systems for springs, none of which I found useful when I was trying to understand pools and why pools occur. So I'm going to say that there are perched pools, which relates to our rock pools thing, where you have an impermeable surface and the water collects, and then generally in this climate, because of shading, you don't get as much evaporative loss and that water is able to persist. But it's not linked to the groundwater system. The other thing that happens is through flow of alluvial water. So within the alluvial channel associated with the contemporary river, there's water in there, and that water comes up and into a pool and then back out of the pool. So basically, what I'm conceptualizing this as is a through-flow lake. So like the lakes here, Lake Joondalup, it's basically you've got a permeable saturated medium with a water table in it, and then you've got a surface expression, and water comes in on this side and goes out on the other side. So this is a very well articulated process, but had never been applied to a pool like this. And then up here is an example. This is a person right there. So just for scale, this is an example where you're going to have alluvial water contributing, but also shading is going to be important in controlling the persistence of the water in that area. So these are kind of the they're kind of geological in that you need hard rock, impermeable hard rock, to catch the perched water. And you need sufficiently, a sufficient volume of alluvial water to have this alluvial through-flow mechanism. The geological controls, we kind of grouped into two categories. So one was where you had contacts at surface, contacts with a geological layer. And here's an example, this happens a bunch, I'm told, where you have a pool at the bottom and you can kind of see a seepage face often, even at the top there. So that's one example. And the other is this topographic constriction, which you can see in photo here. So there's a less permeable layer that's got a narrow channel in it, and really the whole valley, subsurface and surface, has to funnel itself through that channel. And so we see the development of persistent pools at the surface. This one's being called a spring, in that context also. Okay, thanks. And so you can do this regional mapping by overlaying through basement. So that was one of the objectives of the paper, was to articulate the tools we have from these other bits of literature and kind of advise on how you can deploy them in this context. So you can overlay geological mapping. These ones where there's alluvium, you can have alluvial through flow, and it's probably going to be important. This one, there's no alluvium, it's on the edge, and that's going to be a geological contact and a spring. These ones out here, it's on impermeable basement, you'd be thinking it's a perched pool. That simple. This is an example of NDVI, which is mapping of vegetation persistence. And while it can help you identify where a pool could be, it's not going to tell you anything about why that pool is there. A couple of local scale then studies. So you can do this regional stuff and it can suggest, you can intimate why the water is where it is, but you don't know unless you do some more detailed measurements. And here's some examples of that. So at Plunge Pool, we had, this is the conceptualization. So you've got these dikes that kind of create compartments that fill up, and then here we have a pool. So the stream actually goes like this and then does like a waterfall when it's flowing. Lands in this pool, which has some alluvium that will hold it, and then in the absence of stream flow, this pool is also acting as a drain on the groundwater system. So you've got regional outflow, groundwater outflow, and you've got some runoff, and the time frame that this pool can persist on depends on how long this water level maintains above this, and also how much water is stored in the alluvium at the base of it. I will skip this data basically, except it kind of, the groundwater levels is this black line here. It repeats what's over there, but this is what you see in the pool EC is red. And one of the interesting features is this spike. When rain comes, the first bit of rain is salty. So it's flushing salts off the top of the landscape, off the surface, and then the pool EC goes back to the EC of the groundwater after that. And here again, this is Ben's Oasis. So we did some additional data here. This was Sarah Chapman's master's thesis. So here we've got water levels. This time we've got water levels in the alluvium, that we put a little drive point in here to measure in the alluvium. And the pool water level tracks pretty much exactly the alluvium in there. But there's also, and you can see it coming out at surface, regional groundwater coming out of the Whitnome Formation. So there's two things, again, happening there. So it's not as simple as saying there's one mechanism. And it's also not as simple as taking a snapshot of one tracer at one point in time and then doing a magical mass balance off the back of that. Because here's the radon, for example. So you've got higher radon where this alluvial water is coming in. And then that degasses. And then you see radon again here where the regional, up here where the regional groundwater is coming in. And in the stable isotopes, we also have variability associated with the inflow of water in the first place and evaporative enrichment, and then fresh inflow of groundwater and evaporative enrichment. Now there are studies, a number of studies, where people take one sample from a pool, and maybe they do it at the beginning of the dry season and the beginning of the wet season. Maybe they do it in the same place, I don't know. But they're really not accounting for all of this variability that we know happens. So this is just spatial variability at one point in time, but it's also going to vary through time. So we've made this generalization of the Hammersley Basin. We've said that generally there are these mechanisms: perched, groundwater outflow at geological contact, through flow, topographically controlled. And if you can do this generalization, that's great. But you're still going to have to do detailed data collection at a subset of these sites, a representative subset at a minimum, to really understand what's going on. People don't like that message. They don't want us to be telling them they have to do more work. Nonetheless, that's what we're saying. I'm going to hop right over that. So the last little bit is kind of an incomplete piece of work on the Donnelly River. So we're down near Pemberton now, shifted quite a long way south. And the context here is that streams are shifting from perennial to non-perennial as the climate dries. And this Donnelly catchment is a relatively pristine catchment. It's forested. There's not a lot of development on it. It's got some really good ecological values still along the river. But we see these differences in how the river is responding to the drying climate. So we've got a main channel here, which is this line through here, that has become non-perennial. So we've got a stream gauge here, and this is Amy Perrin's analysis. She's looked at this is the 7-day lowest mean flow. And so here it gets to 0. This is where it becomes non-perennial. Kerry Brook, on the other hand, which is a tributary through here, still got flow. Why? Why? This is the overarching question. Unfortunately, it's quite geologically complex when you look at the bedrock geology, with many more faults than we would have liked. A little bit upsetting, but never mind. At any rate, we see this area to this big fat red line, right? This area over here, non-perennial. This area here, perennial. And you might think, oh, it's kind of aligned with the geological transition. Maybe that's it. But it's kind of not, right? Exactly, Kayla, exactly. So what we're trying to do here is really unpacking why these sections are remaining perennial so that we can understand if they will continue to do so or if they might be at risk. And if you look at the, this is the hydrogeology map, the geology, surface geology mapping. So we've got these sort of Cretaceous sediments here and then the younger sediments right at the coast. This is, weathered Yilgarn craton action. We've got the Darling Fault. So is the Darling Fault playing a role? Don't know. I'm going to skip through. This is, if you want to see in the literature, hard rock transitioning to sediments, what happens with groundwater and streams, this is what you find. And it's called mountain front recharge. So you have water that comes out of your mountains, either streamflow or groundwater, and it recharges your sedimentary aquifer system, which is exactly the opposite of what we're seeing here, which is where we have some hard rock and then we have groundwater, we have streamflow that's persisting through this section. So trying to understand what's happening with groundwater levels, they're going down. Yilgarn, maybe not, but actually then when my PhD student Rosie came along and did some more recent measurements, they are actually going down, we think. But this was Amy's this is where she got to, her summary. She thought this Bunbury basalt was quite key in the mapping that she had, suggesting that this shallow weathered zone in the Yilgarn is coming up against a hydraulic barrier and therefore the groundwater's coming out. Also groundwater coming out of the Leaderville, the Warnbro group. This was her conceptualization. We're like, okay, cool, great. And there's her estimates of how much is coming out. So even at the end of summer, in the absence of rainfall, there's still water in this Carey Brook section. Now this is kind of a conceptualization that Rosie's put together from these forested catchments where people studied in the 1980s. People like Jeff Turner did some isotope stuff. It's good work. I trust it. I don't not trust it, but it doesn't add up with what we're seeing now. So 95% of stream flow was runoff and quick flow. And that contrasts to what Amy was seeing in Carey Brook, at any rate, which was lots of groundwater coming in. So we're trying to understand where these differences are. This is where those forestry catchments are. Amy's field site is down here. So maybe it's just the difference between Barley Brook and Carey Brook. So Rosie's doing more work on in these catchments and in Barley Brook. And we're extending, so we had used radon, which, although it's really good for quantifying total volumes, you can't say much about residence times. As soon as something's been in the ground, it's got radon. So we're going to use tritium and carbon-14 and stable isotopes of water to try and further separate out what's happening in terms of streamflow generation processes. We've recently found Hugo Olyrook's from Curtin mapping of the Bunbury basalt, which was both good and bad. Basically, it's all the way along, so that doesn't maybe explain why it's persisting in Carey Brook but not elsewhere. But we haven't quite mapped this in with the streamflow and topography yet. So we've got these two kind of hypotheses that Rosie's going to test. One is groundwater outflows from the Warnbro as the stream traverses the Darling Fault. The other is this role of the Bunbury basalt in being a hydraulic barrier. There's always the question about the faults acting as conduits, which is inferred to be important in, say, groundwater discharge to the Fitzroy River up north. But this is Rosie's problem to unpack, not mine. So that's kind of work in progress. And that's my tour of Western Australia in a nutshell. Some examples of the importance of geology and hydrogeological systems in controlling surface water distribution, generation and persistence. And yeah, so we're just trying to work out why it's wet, not just where it's wet. And this means you need lots of methods at different scales, lots of data, and a bit of persistence yourself.